Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. At the beginning of most months, I make a video talking about some of the books forthcoming that month that really excite me. And yet, here I am at the beginning of August, talking about some books that were forthcoming in the second half of July, but are now already out in the world. I promise that I will get to August's forthcoming books, but I don't know, it might not be until December, the way things are going, or maybe next August. We'll see. As I always start with, you should know that I tend to share very quirky, idiosyncratic lists full of titles that for whatever reason spark my own personal interest or curiosity. So let's get started. I'll start with a list of 5 fascinating books that were released on July the 15th. First is a novel by Mark Kurlansky. Now, you may know this relatively popular author already, not for his novels, but for his quite popular nonfiction. I first read Kurlansky in about 1995, his book about what he called the resurrection of Eastern European Jewry. But most people discovered his work when he began publishing those fascinating histories that focus on a very specific topic in order to discuss something much larger. For example, he wrote one book about cod, the fish that both fueled European desire for exploration and also made it possible. Another was about salt, showing how it shaped the development of trade routes and cities around the globe, etc. But this new novel, out from Bloomsbury, USA, is Cheesecake, a novel. This is the story of a neighborhood on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in the 1970s. After setting that up, the publicity sheet announces what the hinge is. Quote, "Then Cato comes to town. Cato the Elder, a Roman born in 234 BCE, is credited with the earliest written recipe ever found, a recipe for cheesecake. And suddenly, it's all anyone on West 86th Street can talk about." A family of Greek immigrants open a new restaurant, and we watch while their restaurant takes off. They buy up a lot of real estate in the area, and a new kind of upscale community takes over. So this is a setting where gentrification is in the process of happening, but it's not totally clear to me that the subject is considered in anything other than a witty way. The little I've heard about this book so far implies that rather than focusing on the family that opened the shop, the novel is basically a revolving door of quirky characters with no discernible plot. In other words, I'm not totally persuaded by the conceit of this book yet, especially as a novel. Still, Kurlansky has written a lot of entertaining books, and I'm inclined to give him a chance. Have any of you read it already? Okay, the next book I want to discuss is The Aviator and the Showman, Amelia Earhart, George Putnam, and the Marriage That Made an American Icon by Laurie Gwen Shapiro, published by Viking, and getting a lot of attention so far. If you grew up in the U.S. during the 70s and 80s, and I assume it was true both beforehand and afterwards, you probably heard all about the hobby pilot Amelia Earhart. As a young woman, she met George Putnam, heir to fortune and fame, who was looking for just the right woman to fly a secret mission across the Atlantic. What Shapiro, the author of this book, is interested in is the partnership that develops between Earhart and Putnam, a partnership that was professional at first, but soon became romantic as well. We could call Earhart a feminist trailblazer with a lot of ambition. Putnam was sometimes called the P.T. Barnum of publishing, pushing his authors to go to extremes in order to garner attention. In other words, he fed the ambition that Earhart was already starting to show. And this quest for attention that both of them felt led to what the pub sheet calls a certain recklessness that was apparent for a long time, and it led to Earhart's end. What makes this book sound really interesting to me, as that it is not a book that glorifies Earhart's adventures. She's instead a person who lives her life within the social expectations of her time. She fights against the social constraints in many ways, but she also makes compromises. Instead of talking about the myth of Earhart, here we're talking about her life, her daily life, what she wanted most deeply, and also how her marriage shaped how she chose to present herself in public. The story of how that happens highlights Putnam's manipulative personality, which we might even understand now as narcissism. The book also traces the similar behavior that Earhart exhibited. She was arrogant. She took advantage of people when it gave her the advantage instead. Those of us who grew up thinking of her as the brave hero, strong and independent, may have to adjust our image a bit and start seeing her in a bit more complex and nuanced way. Okay, the next book I want to mention is A Year with the Seals, Unlocking the Secrets of the Sea's Most Charismatic and Controversial Creatures by Alix Morris, with a foreword by Cy Montgomery. As is not uncommon in newish mainstream books, what we get here is essentially a memoir of a scientist, or in this case, an environmental journalist, who writes about her own efforts to get to know everything she can about seals, their ecosystems, the way they are affected by climate change, and also their intelligence and their social lives. One of the most interesting parts of the book is the author's discussion of seal repopulation in recent years. As the pub sheet points out, conservation actually works, but it doesn't always make everyone happy. Traditional indigenous seal hunters were frustrated that their livelihoods were threatened in the process. And then there's the fact that seals go after fish in single-minded pursuit, so much so that expanding seal populations have destroyed not only much of the fish population, but the fishing industry too. And the increase in the number of seals has also led to more sharks and other predators along the coast, endangering humans and other animals that were not at as high risk before. Appreciating the amazingness of the seals, while also talking respectfully to people on all sides about the complexity of how conservation works, sounds absolutely fascinating. Another book released on the 15th is A Beginner's Guide to Dying by Simon Boas, published by Vintage. I've already read this book, and I want to talk about it in relation to a couple of other somewhat similar books in a video I think I'll make near the end of the month. So I'm going to keep this kind of short. First, I'll say that this book is new in the States, but it's been out in the UK for a while, and it's been a bestseller. This is a memoir of a man in his 40s diagnosed with terminal cancer that has already spread throughout his body. I'm going to read out the pub sheet description. The author, quote, was determined to die as he had learned to live, optimistically, thinking the best of people, and prioritizing what really matters in life. The author is clearly charming and often funny in kind of a sweet, happy way. One of his big points is that we should always be kind to others and try to make them happy. Another is that we should really live while we can. He puts it this way, quote, if I have it right, carpe that diem and keep it carped. So, despite having what we might think of as a dark topic, it's in fact quite a light little book. There are a lot of things about it that are wonderful, and there are a lot of things that trouble me in it too. One thing I love is that the author is determined to be honest, not to hide his diagnosis or be in denial about his coming death. But at the same time, his relentlessly cheerful attitude is, I am very sure, just one little part of his response to his terminal diagnosis. Choosing not to express more complicated emotions, just doing the happy talk, left me frustrated sometimes. I know this may be my own personal feeling because of what I've been through recently. Watching my relatively young spouse get a similar diagnosis and prognosis, I saw him have all those moments of appreciating in great depth what we all kind of know all along, but really don't embrace most of the time. In other words, it came naturally to David to, quote, keep it carped as much as he could. But at the same time, there was just so much sadness connected so deeply to exactly that desire to live each day fully. I wanted more recognition of that kind of complexity in this book. I'm not certain who the audience is for this book. Is it new patients who might be made to feel like they have to be chipper for other people? Is it for lovers and friends and parents and children who might be grieving and feel like they're being told to act like death isn't so sad? Surely none of those are the target audiences. Like I said, I'll talk a little more about this book later in the month, but for now, I'll leave it at this. So, the last of the books published on the 15th falls into a group of texts I've been talking about since the beginning of this year and squirreling away until September, books about art and artists. As you'll be seeing soon when announcement videos start to be made, there is an art readathon in September called Framed. And I know this book I'm about to mention is already on a couple of my readerly friends' possibilities list. The title is The Club, where American women artists found refuge in Belle Époque, Paris, by Jennifer Dasal. France during this period was at a moment of great stability, both politically and economically, and Americans were flocking to the city to see the sights, including the newly opened Eiffel Tower. Women traveling alone sometimes stayed at what was called the American Girls Club, a real hub for both female expatriates in general, but specifically for creative women interested in the fine arts. These artists forged connections with Paris's whole world of arts and letters, from Gertrude Stein to Rodin. Some became activists, joining with the Pankhursts, for example. But what might be most interesting is not the specific opportunities which these women had access to. Instead, it's the idea that single women of ambition, as the pub sheet calls them, gathered together, sharing their dedication to art and the life of the mind and social activism, and in the process forged a path for all of the women who followed. As I was first reading the publicity sheet of this book, I immediately thought of another book I enjoyed a couple of years ago, Pauline Bren's The Barbizan, an all-women's residential hotel that offered housing to independent young women, many of whom were at nearby programs for career advancement in a variety of careers, including artistic and literary careers. And, of course, by the time I finished reading the pub sheet, I saw that the publishers also saw that connection. Like Bren's book, in the club, we get a window into the lives of a variety of particular women and particular groups, but the main point is not to provide biographical sketches, but to lay out how much of this kind of support and camaraderie could change the entire art world. Okay, on the 24th, the University of Iowa Press released The Writings of Jesmyn Ward, Matters of Black Southern Life and Death by Martyn Bone. This is not a collection of the writings of Jesmyn Ward, which I suppose the title could make you assume if you read it quickly. Instead, this book is an investigation into her work, from her National Book Award-winning novels like Salvage the Bones and Sing Unburied Sing, to her memoir, Men We Reaped. Bone, the author of this study, considers how Ward develops themes including not just the legacies of slavery and segregation, but also the impacts of neoliberal capitalism, especially on Black Southerners. Her writing also deals with the way humans relate to the rest of the natural world. She writes about man-made environmental crises, but also how humans interact with other animals. One of the other big topics that this study considers is how Ward speaks to other Southern writers from earlier times, people from William Faulkner to Toni Morrison. as a major fan of Jesmyn Ward, I'm really looking forward to reading this book much more carefully. And finally, on the 29th of July, came Conversations with Rilke by Maurice Betz, published by Pushkin Press. This study of the poet was written by his French translator. It sounds just wonderful. Betz writes about the time in 1925 when he worked together to translate Rilke's only novel from German into French. In the process, we get to understand a bit about the poet's creative process, but also the translator's creative process and the cultural life in interwar Paris. The relationship between translator and poet also seems so intense. Betz first came to Rilke's work not as a translator, but as a soldier in need of comfort and meaning. In his kit bag during the First World War, Betz carried a book of Rilke's poems with him, and soon the two of them became lifelong friends. This book sounds like something that I would love, just from this description, but the publicity sheets goes on to say, quote, a stunningly written, deeply personal biography that's also a masterclass in the art of translation, perfect for fans of Richard Holmes, Lydia Davis, Kate Briggs, and Julian Green. Well, I am certainly sold on this book. Well, that will do it for today's video. Again, my apologies for being crazily behind, but here's to many great forthcoming reading times for all of us. Thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.